Chapter 1. A Frightful Awakening. The village of St. Mary Mead lay peacefully under a blanket of autumn mist. Its cobblestone streets and quaint cottages were untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But on this serene night, Reverend Henry Langley was jolted from his sleep by a chilling disturbance. In his bedroom, the grandfather clock ticked with an eerie persistence, each chime echoing through the silence. Reverend Langley, a man of habit and gentle temperament, felt an odd thirst that pulled him from his dreams. Wrapping himself in his familiar, worn dressing gown, he quietly made his way down the dim hallway. The house was shrouded in shadows, moonlight casting long, ghostly silhouettes on the walls. As he reached the kitchen, the familiar scents of damp leaves and wood smoke lingered in the air, a comforting reminder of the village's tranquility. But as he reached for a glass from the cupboard, a sharp pain seared through his side. Startled, Reverend Langley stumbled back, his eyes catching the glint of metal in the moonlight. A knife. His heart pounded wildly as he struggled to comprehend the attack. Before he could fully grasp the situation, the shadowy figure lunged again, the blade pressing dangerously close. Instinct took over. Reverend Langley grabbed the assailant's wrist, his fear fueling his strength. In the stillness of the night, a silent struggle unfolded, a dance of shadows and pain. Finally, the attacker retreated, slipping into the darkness as swiftly as they had appeared. Breathless and shaken, Reverend Langley leaned against the kitchen counter, his mind reeling. Who would want to harm a humble clergyman? This was no random act of violence, it was personal, calculated, and deliberate. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the lace curtains of his study, casting delicate patterns on his desk cluttered with sermons and parish records. Reverend Langley sat deep in thought, replaying the events of the night. The attack was too precise to be the work of a stranger. It felt personal, as if the assailant knew him. His mind raced through the people in his life: his wife Eleanor, their spirited daughter Margaret, his ambitious brother Edward, Mr. Jenkins, the loyal servant, and Mrs. Hargreeves, the caretaker for his elderly mother. Each one was woven into the fabric of his life. But could one of them harbor such malice? Haunted by suspicion and fear, Reverend Langley knew he needed help. Someone with sharp insight and a keen understanding of human nature. And there was only one person who fit that description: Miss Marple. Renowned in St. Mary Mead for her remarkable knack for solving mysteries that confounded even the most experienced detectives, Miss Marple was trusted by many. Her unassuming demeanor masked a brilliant mind capable of seeing through lies and illusions. With renewed determination, Reverend Langley penned a letter to Miss Marple, detailing the terrifying events of that night and pleading for her assistance. As he sealed the envelope, a mixture of hope and anxiety settled over him. If anyone could unravel this sinister plot, it was her. Days passed without word, but Reverend Langley held on to his faith, both spiritual and personal, that Miss Marple would come. Little did he know, she was already on her way, ready to shine a light on the darkness that had descended upon his life. Miss Marple knew that if she was to solve this mystery, she needed to look closer at Eleanor Langley. Something about the minister's wife suggested she held vital pieces to the puzzle. With her signature gentle knock, she requested another conversation, and Eleanor graciously welcomed her into the sunroom. The room was bathed in soft, golden light, with blooming geraniums lining the window sills and delicate pastel drapes swaying in the breeze. Miss Marple settled into a floral armchair, her demeanor warm and unthreatening. "Thank you for being so open with me, Eleanor. Would you mind if I asked a few more questions about your relationship with Reverend Langley?" Her voice was calm, almost soothing, matching the serene atmosphere of the room. Eleanor's expression softened, though a flicker of uncertainty passed through her eyes. She offered a gracious nod. "Of course, Miss Marple. What would you like to know?" Miss Marple leaned in slightly, momentarily setting aside her knitting. "Earlier, you mentioned that your sister, Victoria, and your husband were once quite close. Could you tell me more about that?" A shadow of nostalgia clouded Eleanor's face, her shoulders subtly tensing. "Yes, Victoria and Henry were practically inseparable in their youth. They would spend hours discussing everything from philosophy to poetry. Some people in the village gossiped, insinuating an affair, but Henry always dismissed those rumors as nonsense. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with curiosity. Did Victoria ever speak of Henry in a way that suggested her feelings were deeper than friendship? Elena hesitated, a delicate sigh escaping her lips. Victoria was always the livelier one. She had a charm that drew people in, Henry included. There was a strong bond, yes, but I always believed it was platonic. Still, even innocent relationships can be misunderstood, especially in a village like this. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady. And how did you feel about their closeness? Elena's eyes met Miss Marple's, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through her poised demeanor. At first, I was happy for them. Henry and I have always been partners in marriage and in ministry. But as time went on, I began to feel distant from him. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable. I suppose I blamed his work or my own distractions, but the space between us was growing. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. It's natural for relationships to evolve. But did that distance ever lead to disagreements? Elena looked down, her fingers absently tracing the pattern on her teacup. Yes, we argued more often than I'd like to admit. Henry became so engrossed in his work, staying up late, spending more time in his study. I felt neglected. But I loved him, Miss Marple. I never wanted any harm to come to him. Her voice trembled slightly before she steadied herself, taking a measured breath. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the faint tremor in her hands. Have you noticed anything unusual about Henry's behavior lately? Any changes that seemed out of character? A furrow appeared on Elena's brow. Actually, yes. He became secretive working late, locking his study door. I thought it was related to his parish duties, but now, I wonder if there was more to it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Did he ever confide in you about anything troubling him? Any conflicts or threats? Elena shook her head slowly. Henry was always a man of discretion. If there were any problems, he handled them quietly. But I can't imagine who would wish him harm, except perhaps someone who resented his work or his influence in the community. Miss Marple absorbed this in silence, her mind fitting each piece into the growing puzzle. Thank you, Elena. Your honesty is truly helpful. Just one last question. Have you noticed anyone acting strangely around the house? Anyone who seemed overly curious about Henry's affairs? Elena's eyes widened, as if realizing something for the first time. Now that you mention it, Mrs. Hargreeves has been distant lately. She used to be more chatty, but recently she's been reserved, almost secretive. I didn't think much of it, but she trailed off, uncertainty clouding her gaze. Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued. Interesting. Thank you, Elena. You've given me a great deal to think about. As Elena stood to leave, Miss Marple watched her closely, admiring the woman's composure. Yet beneath that graceful exterior, there were layers of complexity, old wounds, and hidden fears that hinted at a more tangled web than she had first suspected. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, the shadows growing long as dusk settled over the village. Elena's words echoed in her mind, weaving together with the other clues she had gathered. The bond between Henry and Victoria, the secrecy, Mrs. Hargreeves' strange behavior. The picture was becoming clearer, but the full truth was still just out of reach. With a deep breath, Miss Marple folded her notes and looked out into the fading light. The darkness was deepening, but she knew that somewhere within it lay the answers she sought, and she was determined to find them. Marple was determined to learn more about Elena Langley, convinced that the minister's wife held crucial clues. With a gentle knock, she requested another meeting. Elena welcomed her into a sunlit sitting room, the space beautifully adorned with blooming geraniums and pastel drapes. Elena, thank you for being so open with me so far. May I ask a few more questions about your relationship with Reverend Langley? Marple's voice was as soothing as the warm afternoon light streaming through the windows. Elena nodded, her expression thoughtful. Of course, Miss Marple. What would you like to know? Marple leaned forward, setting aside her knitting. You mentioned earlier that your sister and Reverend Langley were once quite close. Could you tell me more about that? Elena sighed, her eyes reflecting a mixture of nostalgia and sadness. Yes, My sister Victoria and Henry shared a deep bond when they were younger. They spent countless hours discussing everything from theology to literature. Some in the village whispered about an affair, but Henry always dismissed such talk as unfounded. Marple's eyes sparkled with curiosity. Did Victoria ever speak about Henry in a way that suggested her feelings were more than just familial affection? Elena hesitated, her voice soft. Victoria was always the more spirited one. She had a charm that drew people in, including Henry. While their bond was undeniably close, I believe it was purely platonic. But such intense friendships can easily be misunderstood. Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. And how did you feel about their relationship? Elena's eyes met Marple's, revealing a flicker of vulnerability. At first, I was supportive. Henry and I were partners in both marriage and ministry. But as time went on, I sensed an emotional distance between us. Maybe it was the weight of his responsibilities or my own distractions. Marple offered a gentle smile. Relationships do change over time. But did this distance ever lead to conflicts or serious disagreements? Elena paused, reflecting. Yes, there were disagreements. Henry became more consumed by his work, often staying late in his study. I felt neglected at times, but I loved him deeply. I would never wish him harm, Miss Marple. Marple watched Elena's composed demeanor, noticing the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for her teacup. Have you noticed any changes in Henry's behavior recently? Anything that might explain the attack? Elena's brow furrowed. Now that you mention it, Henry had been more secretive. He worked late into the night, but was vague about his activities. I thought it was just parish matters, but maybe there was more to it. Marple tapped her chin thoughtfully. Secrecy often hides deeper troubles. Did Henry ever mention feeling threatened or having conflicts with anyone? Elena shook her head. He was always discreet. If he faced challenges, he kept them to himself. I can't imagine anyone wishing him harm, except perhaps those who disagreed with his views. Marple's mind raced, piecing together Elena's insights. Thank you, Elena. Your honesty is invaluable. Just one last question. Has anyone around the house been acting oddly or shown unusual interest in Henry's affairs? Elena thought for a moment. Actually, Mrs. Hargreeves has been distant lately. She used to be more open, but recently she seemed preoccupied, almost secretive. I can't quite put my finger on why. Marple's eyes gleamed with renewed interest. Thank you, Elena. You've been incredibly helpful. I believe this information will bring me closer to the truth behind Reverend Langley's attack. As Elena stood to leave, Marple admired her strength. Behind the minister's wife's graceful exterior lay layers of complexity, hinting at hidden tensions. With Elena's revelations about Victoria's bond with Henry and his increasing secrecy, the web of motives grew more tangled. That evening, Marple sat in her guest room reviewing her notes. Elena's insights suggested that hidden emotions and unresolved grievances played a crucial role in the attempted attack. Mrs. Hargreeves' unusual behavior added another layer to the puzzle. As shadows stretched outside her window, Marple felt the pieces starting to connect, bringing her one step closer to solving the mystery of Reverend Langley's midnight visitor. Chapter 4: Margaret's Burden. The morning sun streamed softly through lace curtains as Miss Marple prepared for her next conversation. Having gained valuable insights from Elena, her focus now shifted to Margaret, the minister's daughter. Margaret's vivacious charm and the subtle sadness behind her bright eyes hinted at a deeper story. Marple found Margaret in the drawing room, seated by a window with a book resting on her lap. Her auburn hair flowed over her shoulders, and her sparkling eyes held a mix of warmth and tension. She greeted Marple with a radiant smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple. It's lovely to see you again." "Good morning, Margaret. May I join you?" Marple asked, settling into a chair opposite her. "Of course," Margaret replied, setting her book aside. "I wanted to talk about the night Reverend Langley was attacked." Marple began gently. Margaret's expression grew somber. "It was a terrifying night. I was at the harvest festival with friends. Many villagers can confirm I was there." Marple made a mental note to verify her alibi. "I see. And how have you been coping since then?" Margaret's eyes clouded briefly. "It's been difficult. Father has always been our family's rock, but this has shaken him. And all of us." Marple leaned in, her voice compassionate. I understand. Events like this can stir up old memories. I heard that your father was involved in an incident with your former fiancé, James Whittaker. Can you tell me more about that? Margaret's face paled, her fingers nervously twisting a lock of hair. James and I were inseparable once. We dreamed of a life together, but father disapproved. He thought James was a bad influence and confronted him. Things got out of hand. Her voice trembled, pain evident in her eyes. Marple's expression softened. That must have been incredibly hard for you. Did it change how you felt about your father? Margaret hesitated before nodding. Yes. It created a distance between us. I love him, but I've always felt misunderstood. Losing James left an emptiness that never truly went away. Marple spoke gently. Such deep emotions can shape our actions, even if we don't realize it. Did you ever feel anger or resentment toward your father? Margaret looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I was hurt and angry, but I've tried to move on, to focus on my own life. Marple smiled kindly. You've shown great strength. Just one more question. Do you know anyone who might have had a reason to harm your father? Margaret shook her head. No, father is respected in the community. If anyone harbored resentment, I'm unaware of it. After thanking Margaret for her openness, Marple left the drawing room, her mind swirling with thoughts. Margaret's grief over James and her complicated relationship with her father added new layers to the mystery. Although Margaret's alibi appeared solid, Marple knew that unresolved emotions could lead to unexpected actions. That evening, Marple sat by her window, reflecting on the tangled web of relationships within the Langley family. Margaret's past hinted at hidden motives linked to long-buried heartache. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marple's determination grew. She was getting closer to the truth behind Reverend Langley's midnight visitor. The evening air was heavy, carrying whispers of old secrets that refused to stay buried. Miss Marple sat quietly in her guest room, piecing together the fragments of the mystery surrounding Reverend Langley's attack. The connection between Margaret and James Whittaker added a compelling layer to the case, hinting at motives tied to personal loss and unresolved emotions. Yet, Margaret's alibi was solid, confirmed by multiple witnesses. Miss Marple knew that to uncover the truth, she needed to understand the tangled web of relationships and past grievances. With a determined look, she resolved to dig deeper into Margaret's past, searching for hidden motives that could bring the truth to light. Chapter 5. Edward's ambitions revealed. The next morning dawned bright and clear, its golden light spilling over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, undeterred by the previous day's revelations, turned her focus to Edward Langley, Reverend Langley's younger brother. With his polished demeanor and quiet ambition, Edward was an intriguing piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple found him in his study room, meticulously organized, reflecting Edward's disciplined nature. "Good morning, Edward," she greeted, taking a seat across from him. "Good morning, Miss Marple. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Edward's tone was polite but guarded. "I'd like to ask you about the night of the attack," Miss Marple said, her eyes sharp but kind. Edward leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Of course, it was a terrible shock. Reverend Henry is more than just my brother. He's my mentor." "I understand. You were away on business that night, correct?" Miss Marple asked, her voice casual but probing. "Yes," Edward confirmed. "I was in London for a conference on church administration. I was with several colleagues who can vouch for my presence. It was an important event, one I couldn't miss." Miss Marple made a mental note to verify his alibi, but continued, "Your absence does give you a solid alibi. Yet, I've heard that you're quite ambitious, Edward. Some say you've been eager to take on more responsibilities." Edward's eyes flickered with a trace of defensiveness. "Ambition?" he repeated. "I've always admired Henry and his work. If anything, I've only wanted to help the parish grow." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Ambition isn't inherently bad, but it can be complicated when mixed with family ties. Have you ever felt overshadowed by your brother?" Edward's posture stiffened, his face carefully composed. "Henry is respected, and I've never begrudged him that. If I felt overlooked, I addressed it professionally, never with resentment." Miss Marple nodded, satisfied for now, but not entirely convinced. "Thank you, Edward. Your honesty is appreciated. One last thing, can you think of anyone who might want to harm your brother? Edward's expression softened. No. Reverend Henry is beloved by this community. I can't imagine anyone wishing him harm. Later, Miss Marple visited the local church to confirm Edward's alibi. Speaking to his colleagues, she verified his presence at the conference, solidifying his account. Yet, whispers of his ambition lingered in her mind, suggesting that while Edward might not have acted himself, his desires could have influenced others. Chapter 6. Mr. Jenkins and the Vault Key. The following morning, Miss Marple turned her attention to Mr. Jenkins, the Langley household's long-serving servant. With his quiet demeanor and reputation for reliability, he seemed an unlikely suspect. Yet, his role granted him access to every corner of the house, including Reverend Langley's vault. Mr. Jenkins greeted her with a polite nod as she entered his modest quarters. Good morning, Miss Marple. How can I assist you today? Good morning, Mr. Jenkins. I'd like to ask about your duties, particularly concerning Reverend Langley's vault. Miss Marple began. Mr. Jenkins hesitated, then admitted, yes, I hold the key. Reverend Langley trusts me to safeguard his documents and valuables. And you had the key on the night of the attack? Miss Marple's tone was light, but her gaze was penetrating. Yes, Mr. Jenkins confirmed. I was performing my usual rounds before retiring to my quarters. The house was quiet, as it always is at that hour. Miss Marple noted his calm demeanor, but couldn't ignore the implications of his access to the vault. To verify his account, she asked, was anyone else present or aware of your movements that night? Mr. Jenkins shook his head. No one. The household was asleep, and Reverend Langley was working late, as he often does. Later that day, Miss Marple requested to inspect the vault herself. Mr. Jenkins unlocked it without hesitation, revealing meticulously organized documents, personal mementos, and several locked boxes. These are mostly parish records and private correspondence, he explained. Miss Marple carefully examined the contents, her sharp eyes noting the vault's pristine condition. While nothing seemed out of place, the fact that Mr. Jenkins held the only key kept him on her list of suspects. Chapter 7. The Caretaker's Secrets. Intrigued by the subtle tension she observed between Mr. Jenkins and Mrs. Hargreeves, Miss Marple decided to investigate the caretaker next. Mrs. Hargreeves had always appeared devoted to her duties, caring for Reverend Langley's elderly mother. Yet, something about her guarded demeanor suggested hidden depths. When questioned, Mrs. Hargreeves maintained her calm composure, but Miss Marple's gentle persistence finally cracked her fraud. After discovering foreign letters hidden in a locked drawer, Miss Marple confronted her. These letters suggest you have connections beyond St. Mary Mead. Is there something you're not telling me? Miss Marple's voice was kind but firm. Mrs. Hargreeves hesitated before finally admitting, yes, Miss Marple. I was sent to keep an eye on Reverend Langley. Certain people were concerned about his influence. The revelation startled Miss Marple, but also made sense of the woman's secretive nature. Thank you for your honesty. Though your motives might not be malicious, your presence complicates matters, Miss Marple said. Chapter 8. The Final Revelation. A week later, Miss Marple gathered everyone in Reverend Langley's office. Eleanor, Margaret, Edward, Mr. Jenkins, and Mrs. Hargreaves. Each had motives, but their alibis held firm. Finally, Miss Marple turned to Reverend Langley himself. You orchestrated the attack, she announced, her voice calm but resolute. Gasps filled the room, all eyes fixed on the Reverend, whose face softened into an amused smile. Yes, Miss Marple. It was a test of your detective skills. Miss Marple arched an eyebrow. A test? Reverend Langley nodded. We attended school together. I admired your sharp mind even then. I wanted to see if you could solve a puzzle of my own making. Miss Marple's lips curved into a knowing smile. You were always a clever one, but even the cleverest schemes can be unraveled with patience and keen observation. With the truth revealed, tension gave way to relieved laughter. As she left the Langley household, Miss Marple reflected on the complexity of the case. It was a challenge issued by an old acquaintance. Yet, like all mysteries, it was no match for Miss Marple's insight and determination.